So today's the day that I start working on the door for this cupboard. As I mentioned last time, this door is going to have similar beading that the face frame has. It's also going to have some sawn out and carved Gothic tracery on it. This is essentially areas that are just pierced to leave behind these little patterns, and then those patterns are carved to bevel them or round them, essentially to give them some shadow, to give them some depth and some character, because when the light hits those bevels, you get a lot of shadow and highlight, and it really gives things a lot of visual interest. So we're going to saw and carve out these two patterns. I'm mostly going to just show you working on this one, because this one is the more involved one. So really the most difficult part, I think, of doing these is getting the pattern drawn out. Now you can look in old books. Christopher Schwarz has a new book, obviously, on called the Anarchist Design Book, where he makes an ombre. He has a pattern for a tracery very similar to this one. Mine's a little bit different, but it's very similar. This is a very common style that shows up in a lot of period ombres. So this is the one that we're going to do on the top here. This one on the bottom, this one's different than any of the ones that Chris showed in his book. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to go through how to draw this, because really that's one of the big challenges in doing these, is figuring out how to draw the pattern. So let's take just a couple of minutes and talk about how to draw this pattern before we start to cut it out and carve it.
Start by drawing a square, and then drawing in the diagonals of the square. Draw a circle that is tangent to the sides of the square, using the intersection of the diagonals as the center of the circle. Using the same compass setting, swing 4 arcs with the 4 corners of the square as the center of each arc. Now set your compass 1/4 inch narrower and draw another circle using the same center as the first circle. Without changing the compass setting, swing another arc from each of the 4 corners. Now, widen your compass by 1/2 inch, which is 1/4 inch wider than the original circle, and swing another arc from each of the 4 corners. This time, though, don't make the arcs a full quarter circle, just draw them to where they intersect with each other. Next, draw additional diagonal lines offset 1/4 inch from each side of the original diagonals. This looks kind of messy right now, so let's erase some of the overlapping lines to clean things up a bit. That looks better. You can really start to get an idea of what this is going to look like. Now let's shade the areas that'll be pierced completely through the door. Those dark gray areas will be sawn away, leaving behind a fretwork pattern with connections that are about 1/2 inch wide. Now let's draw on some guides for the carving. These light gray areas will be carved down in a bevel to give the piercing some life. The bevels will really catch and reflect light in different ways, creating highlights and shadows and lots of visual interest. But those corners are still a bit bland, so let's give them some visual punch too. These medium gray areas in the corners will be chip carved down below the surface of the board, but not all the way through. This completes the carving pattern. You can either follow these steps to draw the pattern directly on the wood, or draw it on paper, cut it out, and glue the pattern to the wood. To begin making the tracery elements, I bore out as much of the waste as possible. I'm using a 1/2 inch Forstner bit at the drill press, but a handheld drill or Brason bit could also be used. I'm using a jigsaw to saw out the remaining waste. A coping saw or standard turning saw could also be used for some of the holes, but these saws won't reach the far interior of the tracery, so they can't be used for the entire pattern. If you want to do all the sawing by hand, you'll need a deep throat fret saw or a keyhole saw. The sawn out tracery can be cleaned up with a selection of rasps and files. You can also use a selection of sharp chisels and one of my favorite tools of all time, in-candle gouges. With the sawn tracery cleaned up, I use a knife to roughly bevel the edges of the tracery on the inside of the door. This is done only to clean up the spelching or chipping that results from cleaning up the saw marks. This is not intended to be a decorative carving. The inside of these traceries are usually covered with some kind of fabric to keep out insects and vermin. So the beveling is simply to remove the splintering and soften the rough edges where the fabric will be attached. After beveling the inside of the traceries, a few passes with a smoothing plane cleans up the inside of the door.
On the front side is where we're going to do the fancy carving, the nice carving. You can see I've got a number of carving chisels here. I've got my whole roll of carving chisels out, but in all reality, I'm not going to use all these. Primarily what I'm probably going to use are a couple of straight chisels. I've got a 1/2 and a 3/4 here. I've got a number 3 1/2 inch gouge, a little over 1/2 inch. And this is going to match most of the curves that I have to do. I kind of matched it up, and it looks like for any of the curves that I need to do on this particular pattern, this 1/2 inch number 3 should be able to manage for most of it. I do have some smaller ones if I do need to get in a tight space, but just looking at the pattern overall, I should be pretty comfortable for most of it, just using the 1/2 inch chisel, the 3/4 inch chisel, and a 1/2 inch number 3 gouge. All right, so I'm not going to show you how to do this entire pattern because it's a lot of repetition. I mean, there's 4 of these here, there's 8 of these shapes on the outside, and then there's four corners to do. So I'm probably just going to show you how to do one of these, and then one corner. And then you should have the idea from there. Everything else is just repetition. And if there's anything that comes up during, while I'm carving the rest of this, that I think would be important for you to know other than just the basics on how to do each of these 3 different shapes, I'll mention that as well. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing any kind of repetitive carving like this, it's really good to start to try to keep the same tool in your hand for as long as possible. So that means trying to do as many of the similar or identical cuts as you can. So for example, all of these corners here, everywhere where a corner meets, there's going to need to be a miter or a bevel at that corner. So I can take this chisel and kind of drive it in at an angle there. I don't want to go past the corner, but I can do that in every one of these corners. And before I change tools, even if I change tools, I may stay with this tool as long as I can, I'm going to go and I'm going to do every one of these and do all of them first. And this is just for efficiency. And one thing you do want to keep in mind, you won't have too many problems doing these cuts across the grain. When you're doing cuts like this one here, you're going to want to be careful. You're holding a wedge in your hand. This is the long grain, and this is oak, which is a very easy wood to split. You don't want to split this board. So everywhere where you have a long grain cut, you want to be careful not to go wailing away on this thing so you don't split this board. All right, so I've got all these corners done. I'm going to work on this one here. I think it'll be the easiest one for you to see from this angle. So I'm going to start with my 1/2 inch chisel, or sorry, 3/4 inch chisel. And I just want to start beveling this straight section. Okay. Now you might think that it would be easier to just carve this way with a straight chisel. Even on your curved sections, you might think, well, I'll just carve this way. The problem you're going to run into if you try to do that is that you can start, this grain is running this way, okay? So this has to be carved in this direction, from here to here. You can start carving that way, and you might get pretty well into this corner. And indeed, we're going to do some carving into this corner in that direction. The problem comes when you have to come back this way to carve into this corner. You're carving against the grain, it's going to make it very difficult to do. So I find it easier to remove most of the waste working down across the grain as much as possible, down kind of across this end grain. So by working this way, I can remove the majority of the waste. I'm going to do the same thing on these curves here using a gouge. Again, I'm using a 1/2 inch number 3. I have a bigger number 3 as well, but the curve doesn't match quite as well. So I'm just going to use this 1/2 inch. And even on these curves, I want to do the same thing. I'm going to kind of just chop down across the grain. And your tools have to be sharp for this. Now you can see the benefit here of making this scoring cut through the corner there. That could have broken out and just made a mess in that corner if I didn't make that scoring cut in the corners first. So that's why we do that first. Because now I can just kind of carve down. And while I'm following my pen line or pencil line, I'm letting the gouge kind of find its own path off of the previous cut. And that's letting me cut through here with very little faceting. It's making it a nice smooth cut. All right, I'm going to move on and do the same thing on this one, and then we'll come back to clean up these corners. All right, so doing the curve kind of already took care of most of this corner, so I'm going to finish this one off. When I work on this, I want to move my gouge in this arc because I don't want to cut too far into this corner. And I can just use hand pressure as well. Come back from this side. Come back from this side. Until I get a nice clean corner there. And I apologize if I'm bumping the tripod or getting my hands in the way. It's kind of hard to get a good angle on this and work around the camera and the tripod. And you want to cut that chip out of the corner. You don't want to pry it. You know, a lot of people have said that in carving videos, but the more you can cut and not pry, the cleaner that cut in that corner is going to be. Okay, so there's that corner. Down here, I'm going to have to do something similar. We've got the curve meeting up with the flat. So we get into there, we're going to have to curve this gouge around so that it kind of meets into that corner there. And again, I don't want to pry that, so I'm going to take my straight chisel and I'm come down and cut that chip out. Now I can clean this up a little bit. A little hand pressure. Okay. And over here, I'm going to do the same thing. We have to come in at kind of an angle. We want to be gentle because I don't want to drive that chisel into this wall here. I'll switch back and forth between the chisel and the gouge until that chip pops free. And I can take my chisel, if necessary, and clean this up a little bit if I have to. Okay. We have to do the same thing over here. Now here we have to be careful because we've got to cut against the grain. Gouge in this corner. Again, try not to pry. And there, that chip just falls away. Okay, now that is pretty much done. I can, if there's a little bit of unevenness, I can come back through here and gently pair this, but again, being careful, cutting against the grain in this direction. And I can smooth that up a little bit. So let's move on and do one of these inner ones. Okay, so on this inside, I'm going to use a smaller chisel. This is my 1/2-inch chisel. And the process starts the same way. I'm going to bevel off the straight sections first. And while I'm trying to follow a similar angle that I did here, because it's going to be kind of a straight line. So I want to try and keep a consistent angle here. But it's not important if it's not perfect. You don't need, a guide block or something like that. Just use your eye. Because any minor inconsistency is really not going to be that big of a deal. And it's still going to reflect light and create shadows, and it's still going to give things a lot of visual interest. I'll move on to the gouge. You need to be careful here because in this particular orientation, I'm kind of going across the grain and taking a chance of splitting it. So I want to be careful, and if it seems like it wants to split out, I may have to come in and actually just carve it in this direction. But I would like to try and get some of that waste out if I can. Now, in these areas here, Again, I'm trying not to split the grain. So what you'll notice that I'm kind of doing is sliding and slicing with the gouge as I move down. I'm trying not to split this off. Now, I am no Mary May by any means. I am not a professional carver. I'm not even really that good at it. I can muddle along, but carving is interesting because it's a lot just about reading the grain, and if you can manage to read the grain and follow the direction of the grain as much as you can, you be pretty successful. Everything else after that is just practice and training your eye to see what it is you want to carve and remove the material that isn't part of your carving. So that's pretty good up here. I'm pretty happy with that, and I can come back and clean that up a little bit more later. We'll get this whole thing carved first, the whole panel, and then we'll come back and we can touch up corners and clean up a little bit more. So let's look at these corners now. These are going to be no different than the corners down here. We want to come in from either side and meet in the corner. So there's our curve cut. Sorry if I'm blocking the camera there. There's our flat cut. And we just want to try to get these two cuts to meet. Now if you're doing this in something that's a little softer than oak, you probably won't need the mallet. But in this oak, a lot of times it just doesn't want to carve without a mallet. So there you go. There's a nice corner there. So I'll just do the same thing on these other two corners. All right. Now, you can go back and refine this as much as you feel like later, and I will certainly do that once I'm done with all the carving. But you can now see where we're at. We've got a nice meeting point between these two carvings here, between the two shapes. This comes to a point and then angles and bevels off in either direction. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the rest of these, and then we'll come back. Once these are all done, then we'll work on the corners. The carving pattern in the corners can be a little hard to visualize if you're not quite sure what you're looking at. So I've gone ahead and did this one here. Essentially what we have is an inverted pyramid, or a pyramid carved into the surface of the wood. So you've got three triangles that converge at a point at the bottom. So that's what these drawings are representing here. So there's a pyramid here and there's a pyramid here. You can carve these in a lot of ways. If you are a chip carver, you've probably carved these before on a smaller scale with your chip carving knife. You can do it with a Sloyd knife or a chip carving knife if you have one. However, in this hard oak, you're going to have an awful hard time doing that. So I'm just going to use my 3/4 inch chisel. And the way that I do these, it may or may not be the way they were done historically, is I start by putting the corner of the chisel in the center, and I try to get some kind of depth there. This may not be all the way to depth, especially in this hard white oak, but I want to get deeper in the middle than I am on the outsides. On this long one, I'll kind of extend it. Start in the middle and extend it out to its, walk it along its line. Try and get it all the way out to the extent that it's going to go, all the way out here. At least to get it started there. Now that I have those 3 center lines struck, I can start carving in from the middle, in towards the middle, I should say. And again, I'm trying to keep the inner part low and the outer part high, because that's how that's what the end product is going to look like. So towards the middle you want to keep low, towards the outside you want to keep high. And that's what's going to give you this pyramid shape. Now these chips are probably not going to break away all that easily at first. So you could end up with a bunch of junk in the middle. You're just going to have to kind of carve around that. Take your time. Again, carving is about patience. You don't want to rush, because that's when you make mistakes and you take big chips. So you can see I'm starting to get that shape now, that inverted pyramid, as these chips start to come away. You're going to have to stop every once in a while, kind of clean things up. Again, try not to go too deep in one pass. All right, so now you can see how I'm starting to get that shape. So now I want to refine that. So I'm going to just start to take thinner cuts and try to get, I'm trying to get down to depth, but I'm also trying to get back to my pen line or my pencil line. You have to pay attention to how you hold the chisel, because you want to, again, make sure you've got that pyramid shape where you're deeper at the middle, tapering up to the outside surface. Now sooner or later what's going to happen is you're going to get all these down to a point where you're about the same depth from all sides, and these big chips are going to start to release in the middle. And it's going to depend on the angle that you're cutting in at. So you want to try and keep a similar angle from all different sides. So on this one, I'm getting close, so I'm going to start to kind of clean this up now by pairing, because I don't want to go too deep, and I also don't want to cut into the adjacent faces. I don't want to leave chisel scores in an adjacent face. So I want to be gentle and careful as I get towards the bottom. And just gently pare this down. This one is just about done. Now, if you want, once you get most of the work done, you can come back in with a knife if you've got some areas that need to be cleaned up and you're not comfortable cleaning them up with a chisel, especially like right down in the corner, or maybe your chisel won't reach down into that corner because of the angle you've got. And you can come back with your knife and kind of clean that up a little bit. But this one is mostly done. I might do a little more cleanup on that. But you can see there's my inverted pyramid. Now I'll make another one here, 5 more to go.
Just like the inside of the door, after I finish the carving, I clean up the outside of the door with a few swipes from a smoothing plane. I don't plane off enough to impact the carving, just enough to smooth and clean up the flat areas. To complete the decorative work on the door, I add a scratch bead along each long edge. The tracery and beading give the finished door much more character than it would have as a plain wooden slab. The highlights and shadows are especially evident in a raking light.